NIRS gives us a wealth of data, but interpreting it is challenging because it's so contextual. Essentially what the mitochondria are doing is they are the ones that are utilizing the oxygen that you are breathing in at the cellular level to continue to create energy to keep your muscles contracting. But it just blew my mind that you could have two different legs on the same body that were giving you essentially opposite responses in terms of THB, with SMO2 trending the same way. I think that that is like a little bit of no man's land where you're getting too much stress for too little adaptation. They are able to maintain somewhere between 80 to 90% of their VO2 max for 2 hours.
Hey, Philip, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Sean, for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you. We've been exchanging over message boards for a while, the Moxy Monitor message board more specifically. And so it's a great pleasure to have you on and to be able to maybe dig into some of those questions that I have a little bit farther. So to give a bit of context, you are the exercise physiologist for Moxy Monitor right now. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah, great. Can you maybe give a little bit of your background as well, and where you've come from, how you found NIRS, and what you're doing today?
Yeah. So I initially, I'll start kind of at the beginning. So I have an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering, and through mechanical engineering, or at least the rigors of the studying, I realized that didn't think that mechanical engineering was going to be right for me. And through some self-exploration and all of that, I wound up with this idea in my head that I wanted to be a cross-country coach, some sort of endurance style coach. Mm-hmm. And with that, I was able to kind of leverage some good working relationships with high schools and then junior colleges, and coach or be an assistant coach at the national level for both high school and junior college teams. Mm-hmm. And during that development, I started to have questions about, okay, so what actually does make somebody an elite level performer compared to their peers, and how do we maximize their potential for performance? So I wound up at a kind of small university in Colorado, University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and did my master's degree with Dr. Robert Jacobs, who is a big mitochondrial performance physiologist. Mm-hmm. And through that, unfortunately, we weren't able to get IRB approval for muscle biopsies, which is our typical method of measuring mitochondrial respiration. Mm-hmm. So we had to figure out a way to measure mitochondrial muscle oxidative capacity without doing the invasive nature of a biopsy. Mm-hmm. So that's where we wound up with finding Moxy specifically, and then I used Moxy and other traditional predictors of performance, so VO2 max, efficiency values, fatigue threshold values. And then what we did is we did kind of regression analysis to see what was actually the best predictor of performance. Mm-hmm. And what we were able to do is we were able to verify that indeed VO2 max, efficiency, and economy, or efficiency and fatigue thresholds, are really, really good predictors of endurance performance. Mm. But then when you add on muscle oxidative capacity, you have this almost complete model of what's going on in the human body to predict elite endurance performance. So with that, I started to work with Roger during my master's degree, and he took me on because of the work that I was doing and my interests in terms of performance, and then has allowed me to help new users like yourself, answer these questions. Okay, what the heck do we even use NIRS for? What is it? How do we interpret the data? Because I think that's one of the big ones is, like we were kind of discussing a little bit earlier, is that NIRS gives us a wealth of data, but interpreting it is challenging because it's so contextual. And I mean, Evan Pecan is phenomenal at interpreting this sort of stuff and getting at kind of the nitty-gritty details. Andre Feldman's another really good resource for this sort of stuff. And it's just like the more that we can all put our heads together and learn from what's going on in the context of the exercise physiology that's going on, I think NIRS has the potential to kind of bring us into kind of that next step of exercise physiology and real-time performance. So that was a long-winded answer for what got you into NIRS, but I definitely like the idea of real-time monitoring of endurance performance and all of that. I think NIRS is great technology for it.
And obviously we're going to come back to it and talk about it in detail, but you're doing your doctorate thesis now, is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm doing my doctorate now at Oregon State University, and I'm not doing as much of the applied physiology as I was during my master's degree. I've switched more towards molecular biology and physiology, looking at how our mitochondria adapt to overnutrition. So like the cases of obesity and type 2 diabetes, and then how exercise can be used to actually mitigate the risks of developing metabolic disease. So
interesting.
Still applications for NIRS, but
yeah, absolutely. How far along are you in that process?
I'm about a year and 2 terms in, so I still have like two more years to go. It's been a wild ride thus far.
Yeah. Is this stuff that maybe you've learned so far doing your doctorate work that has maybe shone some light on the information that you get from NIRS from the standpoint of mitochondria or muscle oxidative function?
I think one of the major things that I have learned. So I've done 2 studies. I've done one with human participants and one with mouse participants, so mice. And the one with human participants, we use high intensity interval training, and we just use like 90% heart rate as our measure of workload. And I think that if we were to apply NIRS to that sort of situation, we would actually be able to maximize or at least get more optimal adaptations to our mitochondria if we were monitoring workload via NIRS versus just using heart rate. So that's one of the things that if I could go back and ask my advisors to, like, put a Moxy on somebody's thigh, I think that would provide some good insights. But the doctoral process has also opened my eyes to the need for more good research pertaining to NIRS as kind of a device to monitor optimal training load and those sort of things for people. So those are kind of what's been going on in my mind as I go through this. Like, okay, how do we apply NIRS to this?
Yeah.
And we'll see if that ever happens.
No, it's good, and I think it's very much complementary to all the NIRS work in the sense that you get to better understand what's going on at the mitochondrial level itself. So maybe for people who maybe are not as well versed as you are in the molecular biology side of things, can you give us a mitochondria 101? What is it? What does it do? And then maybe as an add-on to that, how do we get more of it, and how do we make it better?
Yeah. Those are great questions, and this will be great practice for my thesis defense now going forward. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So essentially, if you haven't heard of the mitochondria before, or what people know most about the mitochondria is that they're the powerhouse of the cell, right? Going through biology, I kind of didn't really understand that until I started to actually look at the mitochondria itself. But essentially what the mitochondria are doing is they are the ones that are utilizing the oxygen that you are breathing in at the cellular level to continue to create energy to keep your muscles contracting. So with that in mind, the mitochondria are intimately tied to all processes of energy creation within your body. Whether that's what we call, or what, like a lot of scientists consider anaerobic or non-aerobic exercise metabolism, the mitochondria are still linked to the resynthesis of that energy to keep your creatine phosphate stores high, to replenish glycogen stores, or rephosphorylate glycogen and those sort of things. So the mitochondria are extremely important for all aspects of metabolism. And from a sports performance perspective, there's a few different ways that people have looked at improving your mitochondrial or your volume, and then your actual mitochondrial function. And the main determinants of, say, mitochondrial volume are going to be doing things like your low intensity, really, really long, steady state sort of exercise. And that's going to expand your mitochondria. It's going to give you some mitochondrial hypertrophy, as it were. And then in order to actually improve your mitochondrial function, so the ability of the mitochondria to use oxygen, you need to do high intensity interval things. So in the study that I referenced earlier, we did 1 minute at 90% heart rate, and then we did 1 minute rest. So that kind of fluctuation in extremely hard work bouts for a minute with those minute rests is a really good stressor on the mitochondria to actually get their function to go up. And then two, like sprint training. So sprinting as hard as you possibly can for 30 seconds, like on a bike or something like that, with 2.5 minutes rest. So repeated Wingate test is another really, really good yet miserable way of improving your mitochondrial function itself.
Yeah. I was going to say, once you get past that, what does Brian Kozak say? 17 seconds plus minus 3. That's when trouble starts, right?
Oh yeah. I was at one of the Moxy summits 2 years ago now, and we got it in our head that we wanted to see in real time how my body would respond to repeated Wingate tests. So I was up on a bike wearing a VO2 master, a Moxy monitor, and a heart rate strap. And I was planning on doing 5 Wingates with 2.5 minutes rest just to see the oxygen changes and then the VO2 changes over time. And we got like 3 into it. After the first one, I was like pretty okay. Second one, I got like this throbbing headache. Couldn't catch my breath or anything like that. And then the third one, it was just downhill from there. It was like half the power output that I had at first.
Yeah. I was going to say, don't do this at home, kids, if you're listening.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we talk about maybe what's going on from a Moxy trend perspective, I assume that around the 15 to 20 second mark, that SMO2 is going to be bottoming out. So that, or close to, I guess it depends how fast you start your Wingate. And so we always, sorry to cut you off. We always talk about, or I've heard a lot about, Aaron Davis coins it survival training. Once you've maxed out O2 depletion, and then you keep on going, and that maybe is where we could almost talk about a slightly more anaerobic contribution from glycolysis to the overall mix. But that let's say spending time down there, spending time at very low O2 levels because it's been fully depleted by a high intensity effort, and then continuing to try and move. Does that have any physiological benefits? Is there a right time and place to do this kind of training? Like you were saying, those 30-second repeats, is that something that is really kind of an acute thing that you don't want to do too much of? Or is that something that can be used more often than we think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that that sort of training where you are just going, I coach one guy for Ironman triathlons, and every once in a while I'm like, okay, today's workout is going to be a go see God workout, where at the end of that workout, I want you to be, knocking on the pearly gates. Like, you're giving everything you absolutely have. And I would say that for the most part, that sort of super, super high intensity stuff should be used very, very deliberately and sparingly. And the reason I say that is because, there's a fine balance between how much stress you can input into the cell and still get recovery and then come back the next day and still be able to continue to function, and, just totally obliterating everything and having to take a week off because, you know, you overdid it. I mean, I make the mistake all the time. Like I do CrossFit now, and I can only work out twice a week. So pretty much those 2 days, Friday and Saturday, I just go and I just like destroy my body. But if I was actually training for something or doing something for performance, I would need to back off on the intensity so that I can recover and recuperate in order to actually be able to continue on with that consistent training program.
Yeah. From a cellular perspective, what is going on when you start drawing out those high intensity efforts past the point of let's say getting SMO2 as far down as possible and then letting it recover? What if you keep it down there? What is actually going on at the cellular level that is detrimental in the long run? Again, not if, like you said, if it's a once a month or once every 3 weeks, it's that acute stressor that is going to be beneficial. But if we repeat that too often and too long, what are the effects on the body?
Yeah. So there's a really good paper that reviews kind of the cellular stresses of what's going on during exercise, and some of the major things that are going on is you have, you know, you're not going to have a depletion of ATP, but you're going to have so much ADP and inorganic phosphate that you're actually going to start to precipitate out. And sorry if I'm getting too into the weeds here, but you're going to run into issues with your calcium, your calcium control at your sarcoplasm. So you're not going to be able to contract as well. And that's kind of like why you get to fatigue. You're also going to be putting out a buttload of reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species when you're just redlining for as hard as you possibly can. And what happens there is those reactive oxygen and nitrogen species can then go and bind to different components of, say, the mitochondria. And it just takes time for those damaged components to get recycled and then resynthesized and placed back in. So if you're constantly overdoing it, you're going to see this increase in damaged proteins that keeps building with no kind of super compensation or what we talk about, right? So you have this accumulation of damage with no with the inability to actually like replace those proteins or building blocks. So you're essentially taking out, you know, a brick from your house and you're not replacing that brick anymore, and eventually that house could crumble. So that's where you see people getting sick, overuse injuries, those sort of things. Does that kind of answer your question in terms of what's going on cellularly?
Yeah, it does. It's funny because way back, probably 6-7 years, well, way back for me, 6-7 years ago, when I started reading stuff about training, I saw a great conditioning focused presentation, and they were talking about the different energy systems with still on the old model, but they were talking about the fact that essentially too much glycolytic work, that's how they coined it back then, but I guess we can coin that survival training, as Aaron Davis would say now, like you said, redlining and just keeping the foot down for as long as you can. Those types of training sessions can be used sparingly, but do have negative effects. They go against all the what he would have called back then. I forget who had made that presentation, but anyway, he said all those glycolytic adaptations go against all the aerobic adaptations. So like you said, developing the mitochondria, making it better, making it more efficient, all those things are going to be impacted negatively by too much of that really high intensity continued work, right?
Yeah. And there's a lot of people now who have gone or started to embrace this idea of like 80-20 rule. So 80% of your, say, endurance training should be done at like zone 2 or lower. And then 20% of your training should be done at as hard of a capacity, you know, zone 4, zone 5 sort of training as you can. Because it's not necessarily like we're talking about like the more the better. It's the optimal prescription of that high intensity training done at the correct moment is going to lead to the optimal adaptations.
Yeah, and for the right person at the right moment. Because
exactly. So it's going to be different.
If we start talking about limiters.
Sorry, we're both getting excited about this.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, because when we start talking about limiters, someone who might benefit from a lot of zone 2 work, someone else might might not. I don't know if that is true, because I guess everybody can benefit from well monitored or well applied zone 2 work. But I guess
Right.
if we talk about repeat sprints, for example, that are maybe not drawn out but that are repeat sprints, if somebody has a cardiac limitation, that might go against getting him better at bringing more blood, because you're just making the muscle better at that point, which
Right.
makes your compensator better, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's like, to what extent do we need to continue to stress the mitochondria with those high intensity interval training bouts? Or, kind of like Evan talks about with, like, if you're doing cardiac output training, right?
Mm-hmm.
You start with a fairly, it's a moderately heavy load, but it's not enough to cause occlusions.
Mm-hmm.
And then you slowly increase that intensity over time.
Mm-hmm.
So you're increasing cardiac output. So you're maximizing cardiac output. But that looks totally different than if you're just doing like repeat Wingate tests,
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to cause an occlusion right away. You're not going to potentially, stimulate angiogenesis or capillary formation as well, as doing kind of that like drawn out, increasing intensity cardiac output workout.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to come back to that zone 2 talk, because I did one this afternoon, and I have questions for you. So we'll come back to it, but I'd like to talk about shift to the Moxy now. And if you had to give us or talk about the Moxy and say, what are its strengths, and then what are its weaknesses as it currently exists, I guess, and is used by most people, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I think at least in terms of endurance sports, which I'm the most familiar with, I think that Moxy's strengths are the ability to monitor and implement individualized workouts / warm-ups. So I think the warm-up aspect is really important. And that is something, I think it was back in 2017, a coach gave a presentation during the Moxy Summit about proper warm-up, and it kind of changed the whole idea or the way that I think about warm-ups. And I think Moxy gives you the tool to actually monitor how well warmed up you are without overdoing it. And that's what a lot of people are doing, is they're overdoing these warm-ups, and it's resulting in inadequate or non-optimal performance. The next thing that I think Moxy is really good at is monitoring workouts, so work bouts, and then auto regulation of those workouts themselves. So I know this, and this can be used in strength training or in endurance training. But if you're doing repeated load, say like 3-minute intervals, then what you can do is you can set an upper limit for your rest bouts and a lower limit for your work bouts. Yeah. And when you hit that lower limit, you stop. When you hit that upper limit, you start again. So it gives a really good kind of prescriptive tool for an athlete to be like, okay, you're going to go when it hits 70%, and you're going to stop when you hit 20%. And no matter how long it takes for you to get back to 70%, you're going to get back to 70%. And it also gives you this idea of you can stop the workout or the intervals whenever the prescribed rest or work bouts aren't there anymore. And that was something I always struggled with as a runner, and then a junior college runner, is a lot of workouts would be just prescribed to the best 2 athletes on the team. And then the other, 7 guys were just holding on when they're running around the track. We're like doing mile repeats at 5:20 pace, and I'm dying. The front 2 guys are fine. They're getting adequate stimulus. But after the first one, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm cashed out. Yeah. And so Moxy really does give you this like ability to monitor in real time how your body is responding to the workload. In terms of limitations, I think that some of the major limitations are the fact that it's NIRS in general is a very young field, particularly the portable NIRS devices. So as we'll discuss a little bit later, it's like you sent a 515 test or a repeated step test to me. I analyzed it. These are, and then came up with, these are the inputs that I have. Then you sent it to Andrew Feldman, and he, has differing, kind of opinions and trends he's looking at. So there's still not a complete consensus about what's really going on and how things are changing. I think that's really cool because it gives coaches kind of the flexibility and leeway to explore and implement and experiment with different like assessments and those sort of things.
And training
But
tools
it does,
and methods and approaches and
yeah, but it is a major limitation because it's like, the research literature is almost just to be like, oh, well, SMO2 got lower after 3 weeks of training. Like that's all. Like the research, like I've always heard, is lagging probably like 5-10 years behind what the coaches are actually doing. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is that for Moxy, somebody needs to be doing the the baseline big rock experiments to be like, okay, these are the responses of SMO2. This is how they relate to things like VO2 max or oxygen consumption during a ramp test, like other things like that. And then we need to start to compare those to things like critical power, which I think has started to be done.
Yeah, Evan's working on that quite a bit, I think.
Yeah. And that's like some cool stuff. That's some stuff I started to think about during my master's degree. It was like, well, what if there's a critical SMO2? Where if you do a repeated, like a 3-minute critical power test, how does the SMO2 curve respond? Is it similar to critical power? Is it inverse to critical power? And then how does that manifest itself in terms of like VO2 max in relation to that? So it's good that people are finally starting to do those sort of things. And then another limitation, I think, is that a lot of and this is where Moxy portal comes in, right? And I I don't mean to, plug the Moxy portal, but there's a big need for the ability to analyze and interpret graphs from THB and SMO2 that hasn't been filled by industry yet. So I'm glad. I am actually so excited that the Moxy portal has gotten so much traction and so much funding already. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. And I think that it will provide a really good platform for people to start to share ideas, interpret data better, build kind of like this massive database of all these different things that are going on with different workouts and workloads and all those sort of things. So hopefully we can start to glean a little bit more information from the big data that could be collected, of course, if people are willing to share their data and all of that sort of stuff.
But that's one of the things that I'm super excited about using the Moxy, is that it's like you said, there's a lack of research, maybe a lack of consensus or overall understanding on some of the factors or inputs that influence the different data trends that we can see. But at the same time, it gives you the opportunity to start with a blank slate and just to try stuff and then essentially make up your own little science experiment. Because it literally is what it is. It's like, okay, right now I did that identical workout twice already, and I'm already seeing slight differences. For example, I did a standardized warm up, which I realized at first I wasn't doing a good enough job with it. So thanks to Moxy, now I know that, hey, I need those couple of sprint bouts at the end of my warm up. Otherwise my SMO2 is not going to be maxing out. So I was missing on that for a little bit before, I guess, using Moxy. And then I've been doing on the bike erg 5 sets of 5 minute on, 2 minutes off at 250 watts, just flat across all 5. And that's my baseline. And I've done it twice already. First session, interval number 3, I started seeing a slight venous occlusion from the THB trend. And already on the next workout, heart rate is 2 or 3 beats lower on average across the whole thing. SMO2 doesn't drop as low. Keep in mind, I'm not in a trained state. I'm coming back from an injury. So treat me as kind of a newbie on the physiology side or the performance side. But essentially, I'm already seeing from one session to the next, 2 days apart, that my body's reacting differently. I'm not needing my heart to beat as hard. I'm not needing as much oxygen from a DSAT standpoint, and I'm not occluding as fast on the second workout. I was only starting to see a slight venous occlusion on set number 4 instead of set number 3. And then, that's what I want to do is do that again 2 or 3 times. And then I can go and play with it. I can say, okay, what if I use kind of Evan's approach of doing a gradual increase in pace throughout the 5 minutes? What is the effect on the cardiac system? What is the effect on the muscular system? What if I do the opposite? I start faster and I end slower. Theoretically, it gets you to a higher VO2 percentage, and so it might be a little more taxing on the respiratory system, but I haven't had a chance to see it yet. But try to do all those little things and kind of learn from it to try and drive some conclusions, or maybe disprove some hypotheses and try to build new ones down the line. That's I think one of the parts that is really exciting in this new field, is that you can really literally do whatever you want with it.
Yeah. And I think actually that kind of brings up like another limitation, is that there's so much variability in terms of like SMO2 response to exercise itself, that it's almost, or it's extremely challenging then to go and look at like group norms for response to exercise, right? Because you could have a utilization limited athlete whose SMO2 doesn't change during the entire workout. You could have somebody whose SMO2 like drops, and then they can maintain like 5% for, like 10, 20 minutes. Or you could have somebody who, gets to 40%, and that's kind of their floor as well. So there's so much variation that I think it's really cool to be able to see what you can do and then compare yourself to yourself. But that could be a limitation in terms of the research that is done, because, maybe if the variation is too much, then it kind of washes out any ability to actually see minute changes in the effects of, say, SMO2 or THB trends or other things like that. But yeah, that was I was doing a lot of auto regulation training when the US was in like stay at home orders, and I was doing it with air squats. So I was just doing a ton of air squats. And when I came back to, from just working out at home to the CrossFit gym, I was probably one of like the fittest people. Like, I mean, not to toot my own horn, but like, I think that the auto regulation training really helped to give me an idea of what was adequate stimulus, what were the different things that could affect, my ability to recover after like 25 air squats or something like that. And I've carried that over to the actual workouts themselves, where, it's one of those things where you can, if you've ever watched somebody do burpees, if they do the jumping burpees where they're like hopping back and then jumping up and hopping back, those people have a tendency to cash out really, really, really fast. And I think that there's a lot of kind of occlusions that are going on, because every time you jump, you have those high muscular contractions. Whereas if you change your form a little bit as to just step back, so you just step back versus jump back, I think you reduce the amount of occlusions that you have. You can continue to drive SMO2 deliver or oxygen delivery to your muscle. And then I could almost essentially just do burpees forever at that pace. It's slightly slower, but in terms of like being able to recover and everything, it helps a lot. And now that I talk about it, I'm actually going to try and I'm going to put a Moxy on my leg the next time we do burpees, and I'm going to try the difference, to see if I can sense a difference between the two, because that's been my working hypothesis thus far. And I haven't tested it yet. And it's like,
but that's what's cool, is that you can make up your own hypotheses and then test them and then see if it makes sense. And then if it works on you, you can maybe test it with a couple other people and see if it holds true or if it's individual to you. And I think the like you said, the insights that it gives you on how you're recovering and what is going on inside your muscle, it's insights that you couldn't get from any other tool, especially not in the middle of a workout. And so, like you said, to know yourself better, if nothing else, to have a better warm-up that's tailored to you and your needs, and then like you said, what if I slightly change the technique on this movement or that movement? What's the difference? Another one that I'm waiting to try I'm wanting to try soon is stroke rate and damper settings on the rower or on the bike rig. Well, not the stroke rate on the bike rig, but on the rower. What is the difference between a R20 and an R30 and an R36 on the different systems at a given power output? And then the damper setting, what is that actually affecting? And all those things that we have, ideas, but again, do they hold true once we put a sensor on the leg and see what actually is going on?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And so the head coach at the CrossFit gym that I go to so I rode my freshman year of college, and I would always find that for me, the optimal kind of stroke rate, especially for a 2K, was anywhere between we'll say 26 and 32. But there were some guys who were like 34 is money for them. And then there were other guys who were like, oh, well, 26, kind of that low end was optimal for them. And I wonder, if there's any sort of correlation between, say, respiratory limited athletes, cardiac limited athletes, and then their preferred stroke rate or cadence on a bike or other things like that. Because I know I struggle on the bike. Anything lower than about 70 RPMs just destroys me. And so if I can get up to 90 or 100, I can, well, when I was trained, I could maintain about 300 watts for a really long time. And I think there's something to say there about, the contraction process and not causing venous occlusions or arterial occlusions, those sort of things. So that would be really cool to look into as well.
Yeah, exactly. What, in terms of auto-regulating work with Moxy, what else have you tried so far?
So I've done auto-regulation of like outdoor sprints. That was an interesting one. So I haven't done it in a while just because I too got injured. It messed up my Achilles. But I was doing, what was it? It was like 30 to 60 yard sprints. And then what I would do is I would say, okay, my recovery SMO2 after a good warm up is about 70%. So that's going to be my threshold for recovery. And then I would watch to see where my SMO2 got down to during the sprints themselves. And if I was unable to get to within 10% of that on two subsequent sprints, then I just call it a day. And it's amazing the difference between, one day to the next. I repeated it, I think every few days. It's been a while, but every few days. And some days I could get like 5 or 6 in a row. And then another day I had to stop it at 12 because I was recovering up to 75% super fast. And then I was, getting down to 20% and just kept being able to hold that all day. So I was like, okay, I think 12 is good because that's double what I did 2 days ago. But that kind of brings up another kind of point is that, I could have kept going, but I think that, in terms of staying consistent in the long run of performance, it was better for me to cut the workout short at 12 rather than keep pushing and eke out that last little percentage of, say, like damage or reactive oxygen species or metabolic flux, just in order for the recovery process to continue to occur.
Do you have talking about sprints, running specifically, do you have a favorite placement for the sensor? Is it a VL on the bike? Is it worth it putting it on the hamstring? What do you think?
I've found that the vastus lateralis is generally fairly responsive. It's a big muscle, easy to target. I don't have very much hair on my thighs just because I wear kind of tighter pants and stuff, so the hair is always rubbed off. So I don't have any issues with tape sticking. I could see utility, like say for instance, if I went back to do like sprints now, I would probably put it on my gastroc, especially on my affected leg,
Mm,
just to make sure that I'm monitoring SMO2 um, at my kind of weakest link right
mm,
now,
mm,
just to see how things are changing. Because in the past I have two Moxys, so I've done bilateral SMO2 tests
mm.
during like a 515 test, and it's pretty amazing. You can get upwards of 20 to 30% difference if you have strength differences in your legs, coordination differences between your legs, past injuries, those sort of things. Um, so yeah, I would typically target vastus lateralis just because it's so kind of robust. Um, but I've had success, with the gastroc. I haven't really done as much the hamstring just because I think hamstring muscles are a little bit smaller, so they're a little bit more challenging to try to reach back and look where the actual hamstring is and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just my experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you bring up a good point, which is using NIRS as a monitoring tool for either return to play or rehab, or to, like you said, to monitor for potential injuries. How much more work, or how much work have you seen other people do in that realm when it comes to using it almost in the as a physio almost, rather than a coach or an athlete?
Yeah, I've actually discussed with a couple of physiotherapists. So Nancy Quick comes to mind. She works out of Colorado, and she has started to use Moxy for return to play, namely with I think they're older population that like triathletes and those sort of things. But there have been people that I've talked to in the past that have definitely used Moxy to monitor SMO2 in, say, like an ACL rehabilitation protocol.
Mm.
We have to remember that Moxy is not FDA approved, so it's not actually a medical device or anything. But I do think that it could be a useful tool for physios to get an idea of how is this athlete coping with the different strengthening exercises, training exercises, those sort of things that they're doing, to get a more precise measure of, say, tissue quality, the ability to contract and extract oxygen, those sort of things. Because at least from my understanding, up until this point, I don't really think that there was any device that you could use that actually monitored how this specific muscle was responding to a return to play sort of situation. It's more like, we'll measure strength between the legs, try to get those to even out. But oxygen is so closely related to all muscle contraction. It's like, if you could look at oxygen levels, why wouldn't you do that? That's
Today's episode is sponsored by Strength Coach Network, the #1 education and networking platform for strength and conditioning coaches. Strength Coach Network offers over 200 hours of video education delivered by elite level presenters such as Dan Pfaff, Jada Mayo, Derek Hansen, Carl Dietz, and Buddy Morris. If you work with or want to work with team sport athletes and take your coaching to the next level, you will find everything you need to know on topics such as speed development, plyometric training, conditioning, rehab, program design, and much, much more. Strength Coach Network also allows you to interact with hundreds of coaches from all over the world, ranging from top NFL, NBA, and MLB coaches all the way to the grassroots level. You can ask questions, respond to popular threads, and get valuable insight from the best in the business. Strength Coach Network also covers career and business development tailored specifically for coaches. If you want a resume critique, need to get ready for an interview, or are looking for professional networking advice, go to strengthcoachnetwork.com/upside to get your first month at half price. That's strengthcoachnetwork.com/upside. Yeah, and if my memory serves, Aaron Davis has a good presentation on the Moxy Monitor YouTube channel about using the Moxy in that context. So for those who want to go dig a little bit, you could go check that out. I think it's a good place to start. I want to talk about, I want to try and maybe explore the things that are a little bit more difficult with you, since you're the man for the job. If people want, let's say, an overview of how all these things work, I recommend You go check out maybe the other episodes I did with Andrew Feldman, Evan Pycon, Aaron Davis, Patrick Estes, Brian Kozak, just to name a few, or even with Roger. But so one thing I want to ask you is, what SMO2 trends have you seen so far that still don't make sense to you?
So there was somebody who, when I first started to get into the kind of like work with NIRS and Moxy as the staff physiologist, they reached out to me on the forum, and they showed one leg that was it was during a 515 test. They had THB in their right leg was compression response. So at the onset of the load, THB would go down, stay flat, and then come back up, and then SMO2 would drop accordingly throughout the intervals. And then as that moved on, it actually stayed a compression response the entire time. SMO2 just kept dropping lower and lower and lower. But then in the opposite leg, at the onset of load, it was the complete it was like completely opposite THB response. It would go from, kind of low and spike up and then just hold flat. And at first, like, that just like blew my mind. I was like, what the heck is actually happening here? And then after, obviously, talking with Evan and getting a little bit more comfortable with like these THB responses, that's, definitely something that's like either a venous occlusion or depending on if it were to get flat, an arterial occlusion. But it just blew my mind that you could have two different legs on the same body that were giving you essentially opposite responses in terms of THB, with SMO2 trending the same way. So it indicated to me that, it's like, maybe it's not as simple as looking at just one leg or one muscle, even though, if you have one Moxy, that's like the best that you can obviously do, and you can still get a lot of useful information out of it. But another thing is that I think a lot of people, they'll like, it's what Evan kind of says in his NIRS physiology course, is like, everything needs to be interpreted in the context of what the data was gathered in. And a lot of people, when they reach out to me on the forum or other things like that, they just say, hey, here are the responses. What the heck's going on? And my bet, I'm just like, well, I don't know exactly what this person was doing, but based on what's actually happening, X, Y, and Z could be going on. And that's how I generally answer questions, is like, this is what could be happening, but we probably need more information, because if this is happening, then this could be happening, so on and so forth. So I don't have very many specific like examples, but the more descriptive somebody can be, the better I think we can interpret these responses contextually.
We'll stay on the SMO2 for now, and then I want to talk about THB as well a little bit after. So a resting value that I've heard many people talk about as being ideal is something above 80%. I don't know if that's true or not. What contributes to the fact of being able to get a high-ish resting value in SMO2? I know Daniel Crumbach talks about, I believe, iron deficiency as being maybe one of the contributing factors, but I'm not sure about this. What is your take on that? Maybe I'll add a practical example. So if somebody comes to you and no matter what you do in their warm up, they can't get above 60 or 65%, do you just say, well, that's just what they have and that's what we have to work with? Or is there a way to look for ways to try and maybe get that resting value higher?
Yeah. So I would say that just from a general perspective, when people come in and just totally cold, you put the Moxy on their muscle, you can see anywhere between like 40 and 70% SMO2. But with a proper warm up, you should be able to get SMO2 up to say like 70 to 90%. I would say those would be kind of the targets that we would be aiming for. I am not familiar with the literature in terms of like anemia and SMO2. It's completely possible if you were anemic, you would have less oxygen carrying capacity. So that could result in lower SMO2 values. I wonder if anemia is related to low arterial saturation as well.
Mm.
But again, I am not very familiar with that literature
Okay.
or the people who have done work with that. Um, in order to maximize SMO2 for a warm up, though, what I would say is that there's a few different ways you can approach it. The first one would be getting somebody to do a very, very, very easy like ride to get cardiac output up without demanding too much oxygen at the muscle. Because that's the idea, right? Is that you want to oversupply oxygen with little to no demand from the muscle, so that you're over delivering on that O2. If that doesn't work, then doing something like a high spin rate, say on the bike or on the run, just to get kind of an oxygen gradient going. So you're by increasing that cadence, you're going to increase the demand for muscle. You're going to see SMO2 go down, and then you're going to get a buildup of metabolites that could stimulate vasodilation. And then after proper recovery, so walking or really, really easy biking, you should see kind of a peak or a hyperemic response in that SMO2. And that should continue to rise if you repeat those fast, quick cadence intervals. And I know, so Richard Wharton, he runs a YouTube channel called Online Bike Coach, and he has done some really cool, comprehensive, like warm up YouTube videos. So if people are interested in that, I do recommend checking him out. Another thing that I've seen are people who do like 3 minutes at 80 to 90% of, say, your VO2 max velocity or something like that. And again, the whole idea is to create that kind of oxygen gradient where you're pulling oxygen lower and then maintaining it for a little while and then releasing kind of that demand for oxygen, and keeping that heart rate then is going to stay high, and you're going to get an over delivery of oxygen. I would say if you try those three things, so the really light, easy work, the fast cadence, short sprint work, or the 3 minute 80 to 90% work, and you don't see any movement of SMO2 up, oh man, that would be hard. That would be a challenge. Because there's got to be some sort of compensation if they're working hard enough at those two, like sprints and 90%, or if they're working light enough at that really easy pace. If they're not working light enough, then what you're going to see with SMO2 is it's just going to go down and just stay down. Whereas if they're working light enough, it should go down, and then it should start to rise over the course of time. So just like tweaking those sort of things, and maybe with like, so I know for me, for running, like my SMO2 has a tendency to be really, really low all the time. So maybe starting an athlete with like a bike warm up and then transitioning them to a run could be a good intermediate step to raise SMO2. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. So essentially they should be able to get to that 70 to 90 range with a proper warm up. If not, maybe there's other questions to ask.
Yeah, and there could also be issues with say the position of the sensor or something like that. If it's really on like a lot of connective tissue, you're probably not going to see very much change in SMO2. So just maybe moving the sensor, a few centimeters up or down. That's always another thing that I encourage people to look out for.
Let's talk about the other side of the curve. After a work bout or after a hard interval, you have that reoxygenation, resaturation that's going on. So you have that SMO2 trend that's coming back up, and that should if all things are well, and if the person is ready to do another one, go back to your recovery baseline or recovery threshold, however you want to call it. What are the main things that affect the rate of resaturation after either a short interval or a longer interval?
Yeah. So the rates of reoxygenation, I think, are dictated by the amount of ATP that needs to be replenished to the PCR, to phosphocreatine and glycolytic systems by your mitochondria. So if it's more, then it's going to be slower. Your heart's ability to deliver oxygen and oxygenated blood. So your pulmonary and your cardiac capacity to deliver and exchange metabolic byproducts with oxygen. I think those are two of the major factors. I know on the flip side of things, so the rate of deoxygenation is actually dictated fairly accurately through your mitochondria's ability to extract oxygen. So if you're doing like an all-out exercise test, the ability of your mitochondria to extract oxygen is going to make that curve a lot steeper. Okay. You're going to be able to reach that 0% a lot faster.
Yeah. And so on the way back up on the resaturation side, if you see someone who has a very slow resaturation curve or a very flat, let's say, resaturation curve, what kind of work would you prescribe to that person in order for them to recover faster? Let's say maybe it's a team sport athlete, like a rugby player or a soccer player. You want to be able to sprint. You want to be able to recover fast or faster than you are if you're not recovering fast, so that you're ready for the next effort. Is there some interventions that you can program for that person in order to get them to improve their rate of resaturation?
Yeah, I would say even like the first thing that I would look at is how is that person recovering? You know, are they lock-kneed, just standing around? Are they walking around? You know, are they like what sort of posture do they have? Because if you're at least from what I've seen in like a 515 test, the rate of resaturation of SMO2 is highly dependent on what leg is up, what leg is down, how much weight you're putting on different legs. And then more specifically with running, if you are standing lock-kneed on the side of a treadmill, you're going to be causing occlusions to happen, right? So you could be limiting how much oxygen is actually reaching those muscles and then being recirculated. So that would be the first thing I would look at. The next thing I would look at is, you know, if we're talking about the rate of reoxygenation being related to things like cardiac output or respiratory limitation, you could look at somebody's ability to breathe. So that's again not my field of expertise. Evan has done a ton with that. I know a lot of other people who have done a lot of respiratory training for respiratory limited athletes. So that could be another approach you could take is how is this athlete breathing? Like, are they limited in terms of their thoracic mobility to actually expand their rib cage and everything? Because if they're having longer, deeper, quicker breaths, and they have the ability to exchange more metabolites with oxygen in the environment, then they should be able to unload oxygen better and faster. And then the last thing would be looking at kind of an athlete's cardiovascular output or kind of targeting their VO2 max. And I know that, so VO2 max is not, you know, necessarily the best predictor of performance, but what it does dictate is the upper level or the ceiling for oxygen utilization within the body. Yeah. And if that person has a lacking VO2 max, then they could simply be limited by their heart's ability to transport, or their cardiovasculature to actually transport that oxygen to the muscle. So they could benefit from something potentially like those longer, slower intervals where they're increasing their mitochondrial volume density and increasing, say, things like capillary density and other things like that.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of ways to skin the cat, as it were.
I like that. Since you talked about the slower work, I want to dive into that. Like I said, I did a session this afternoon. I was going to go for a nice bike ride because it was beautiful outside, but my front tires busted. I was very disappointed. So I went to the gym, sat on the bike in the sun, and I thought, hey, I'll just do what Daniel would call a zone 2. So where you have a balance between supply and utilization. So just trying to aim for a flat SMO2 curve. And so I just plopped myself at 50% and decided that was my let's say my level for the day, and I just tried to stay between 48 and 52 for an hour on the bike. One thing that I was asking myself is, even after I finished, I went right into it because it was low enough. I started at 80 watts, which I just felt like I was wasting my day. And then honestly, even at the one, I think I averaged 120 watts on the hour ride to stay at that 50, which was painfully slow. I'll have to admit. I think I sweat 2 drops, and that was from the sun, not from the bike. So one of my questions coming off of that very, very easy bike ride was, should I have done a warm up with more intense work in order to get my SMO2 to, I usually sit at 80 to 84 after a good warm up. So should I have done that first and then gone down to maybe a 60, 65%? Or is it okay to just go straight into one of those zone 2s, even if that percentage is going to be lower? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, so there's 3 different SMO2 responses in general to a workload, like a constant workload that's being applied. You can have SMO2 rise, like we were talking about earlier, where you're over delivering oxygen and not utilizing as much. You can have kind of that flat line, which indicates that you're reaching some sort of homeostasis in oxygen delivery and oxygen utilization. And then you can have that ever decreasing trend towards, your fatigue level, whatever, if that's 10% or whatever it is. So I would say that really anything that allows for that homeostasis, so that flat line to be reached, that's probably giving you adequate stimulus in terms of, like nice zone 2, maybe zone 3 training. In this case, for me, I would actually err on the lighter side. So I guess it depends. If it's like purely a recovery workout, I would err on the lighter side of things and try to get that SMO2 to go up. And the reason for that is that if you're over delivering oxygen, then you're hyperoxygenating the tissue, and with the idea that hopefully you're able to kind of supply more oxygen and nutrients to that tissue for that hour of your time. And that's, again, if that's like purely a recovery workout. If it's like zone 2, something like that, then I think, no matter if you do a warm up beforehand or if you just jump right into it, if you're reaching some level of homeostasis, I think that you would be getting kind of the same stimulus and adaptation there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the follow-up would be, what is the right percentage level to sit at? Because I probably could have pushed the watts a little bit and sat on 40%. I can, at this point, I haven't done any prolonged all-out sprints, but I've seen SMO2 peak below 20, so I can definitely go there. So yeah, again, what is the right level for that kind of work? Because it is flat, but if it's flat at 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, it's not the same workload. So how would you decide on that?
Right. I would say I always try to steer athletes away from what I would call like zone 3 training, because I think that is like a little bit of no man's land where you're getting too much stress for too little adaptation. It's a great like racing zone because you are reaching oxygen homeostasis for prolonged periods of time. but that would mean that like, say, you know, that your low is 20 and you start to transition from that flat SMO2 to that, gradual decline in SMO2 at 30%. If you were doing, say, 30% training where you could still operate at homeostasis, you're riding that line of like lactate threshold training or fatigue threshold training or whatever you want to call it, critical power training, that's challenging on your body, right? So if you're aiming to try to, push your lactate threshold up, your power, your critical power, then I would say, yeah, you want to be riding that line. But for a, prolonged, long exercise bout, 1 to 2 hours, I would say, like, as long as you're not actually, reaching that SMO2 decrease, the lighter you can go, you're still going to get, good adaptation or good stimulus from just being on a bike for 2 hours. I mean, from your perspective, you're like, oh my gosh, I literally am dripping like 2 drops of sweat this entire time. This seems so useless to me. That's where it gets challenging, right? Is because you're a strength and conditioning coach, and then you ask your athletes to do that, and they're just like, no, man, that doesn't seem like it's even worth it to me.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, if that's going to drive the adaptations that we're after, then that's
right.
what it is, and that's probably why so few people actually do that true low intensity work. Because all my dreams went out the window today when I realized that this was actually low intensity work, and it was beneficial, but it is so low intensity. I mean, when Charlie Francis said keep your highs high and your lows low, that's what he meant. He's like, you either go or you really, really, really hold yourself back. And that's, like you said, it's avoid the no man's land, right? There's another one that comes to mind is, I think Kierwan and Flat. I don't know where he got it from, but medium works in clothing, not in training. So you either have to be above or below. And the no man's land you want to kind of steer clear from, right?
Yeah. And that's, I mean, even if you look at like the elite level Kenyan runners, like they'll start their long runs at like 10-minute mile pace. And these are the guys that can run 4:36 for 26.2 miles. Like 10-minute mile pace is slow. And they've kind of realized the benefits to that super, super slow training. And I mean, of course, over the years of accumulating 120 miles a week and whatnot, like you're gonna eventually get pretty fast. But I think that there are lessons that we can learn from a lot of these people, especially if performance is your goal. It doesn't matter if you say, quote unquote, have the fastest hour long workout. Like if you're not winning on race day, then what's the point, right? Like. So that's where, so just to kind of tie things back up, I would say during the zone 2, like really, really easy light training, I would encourage an athlete, especially if it's like a recovery day and not like a long run day, to try to find an intensity where they can continue to increase their SMO2 to kind of gamify the actual workout itself. Be like, okay, well, what happens if I slow down a little bit and pick up my cadence? What happens if I speed up a little bit but decrease my cadence? Like, how is my SMO2 responding? With the idea that by oversaturating the muscle with oxygen, you're actually going to facilitate recovery better than if you're just, if you're just playing around in no man's land for an hour and a half.
Yeah, that makes sense. So now that we've tackled the easy part, the SMO2, I want to talk about the THB, because that seems to be the harder one to interpret. Let's call it that. So, in your opinion, as a starting point, THB, the trend that you get from the Moxy, what is it good for, and what should it not be used for in terms of interpretation?
Yeah, that's great. I think so just for everybody out there, so THB gives you a measurement of I think it's nanograms per deciliter or something along those lines. Like that's the actual the unit, the units that are associated with it. don't use it as a surrogate measure for how much THB you actually have in your blood. That's Don't do that. That's only for if you actually get like a real blood test, then you can figure out what your actual total hemoglobin is. So with that precaution in mind, what I think it's really good for is monitoring changes to blood volume underneath the sensor.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get an idea of how your blood volume is changing over time with different stimuli. So the different exercises that you're doing. And then in the context of a workout too, say you're doing like an increasing strength set where you're starting really, really low on like back squats, and then you're slowly increasing your weight. What you would expect to see is SMO2 to be continuing going down because you're higher and higher demand. But then with THB, what you can do is you can monitor the amount of muscle tension that's actually going on. With the lower amounts of muscle tension, just kind of squeezing your capillaries and kind of pushing a little bit of that blood volume out when the muscle is contracting. The second phase would be something called a venous occlusion, which I'm sure you know all about, which is you're stopping the outflow of that blood. Mm-hmm. So at the very beginning of exercise, you push out a little bit of the blood, and then it starts to rebound back up until you're done. And then when you release, then it comes back to kind of a baseline value. And then the final one is an arterial occlusion, where you're contracting so hard that both the arteries and the veins are totally blocked off. So you're just getting the same blood remaining in that portion of the muscle for the entirety of the workout. Mm-hmm. And at that point, you're kind of on borrowed time because you're not delivering any more oxygenated blood. So you see SMO2 drop very, very rapidly. Mm-hmm. And differentiating between when that happens, say whether or not it's like within back squat or within different speeds of running or different power outputs during biking, you can kind of get an idea of when you are acting on borrowed time, as it were. Mm-hmm. Like compression and venous response, you're probably going to be able to like maintain for a while. As soon as you switch to an arterial response, the clock's taken.
Yeah. And is it correct that within the muscle itself, the arterial occlusion doesn't necessarily come right off the bat, but it seems from the little data that I've been able to look at, it seems like it first does compression, then venous, then arterial. Is that the case, or do you see it go straight to an arterial occlusion with very high loads, I guess?
Yeah, I would say with very high loads, you definitely could. Mm-hmm. During my master's degree, in order to measure muscle oxidative capacity with NIRS devices, what you have to do is you get a blood pressure cuff that goes around your thigh. Mm-hmm. And then you turn that blood pressure or that cuff onto above systolic blood pressure. So we would inflate it to like 300 millimeters of mercury to really make sure that no arterial blood was getting into the muscle. Mm-hmm. And it was near instantaneous. You cut that off and then SMO2 just goes, drops. Yeah. So I would say that, if you're approaching like really, really high, say like 1 rep max or other, maybe like a 3 rep max, and you are a cardiovascular limited athlete, then you would definitely see an arterial occlusion probably occurring pretty quickly.
All right, cool. I've got a couple other kind of specific cases case figures to talk about with you here. The first one is a term that I've seen used is reactive hyperemia, which from what I understand means an increase in total blood volume or blood flow throughout the session. And one way I've been told to look at it is if you take your THB value in the warm up, multiply that by your SMO2, but as a SMO2 divided by 100, and then you do the same at the end of your workout. And if you see a massive difference there, that could indicate reactive hyperemia, but I'm still not sure what the implications are from a training standpoint. Do we need to do anything about it? Can we change it? What does it actually mean?
Yeah. So reactive hyperemia, just to make it a little less math heavy, is just this idea that THB could be increasing throughout a training session. And I think the underlying physiology with that is a lot of the times people talk about like CO2 and other vasodilatory agents accumulating in the capillaries. So it's really the accumulation of these vasodilatory agents, and that could be anything from nitric oxide to shear stress from blood rubbing against the capillary walls, to a bunch of other things. You see a relaxing of your capillary beds, which then increases the blood that can actually be in the muscles themselves. And from a 515 perspective or an assessment perspective, if you're seeing that, then there's a correlation between that and then respiratory limited athletes, because it kind of gives us an indication that we are unable, or an athlete is unable, to breathe off the metabolic byproducts that are building up. So there might be some utility in training that athlete's respiratory limitations, or just respiratory muscles. So I would say that yes, if you're seeing reactive hyperemia, just an increase in THB during the rest, then it might be a good idea to train respiratory limitation. However, you would have to rule out this idea that cardiac limitation wasn't the dominating limiter,
because it
for
could
those
be
athletes.
That could be a contributor as well.
It could be, yeah. Most of the time what we see with limitations is that it's some amalgamation of cardiac limitation, respiratory limitation, and skeletal muscle oxygen utilization. Most of the time with trained athletes, an oxygenation utilization is probably not going to happen, because they've trained long enough that their mitochondria are robust enough to extract as much oxygen as can be delivered. If you have an inability to deliver adequate oxygen, then, or, just cycle through, then most likely you're probably going to, in consequence, get a buildup of metabolites, which is going to cause THB to rise as well. Although to a lesser extent than a respiratory limited athlete, because with a cardiac limited athlete, the whole idea is that you actually don't have enough blood to perfuse all the muscles necessary during high intensity exercise. So you actually are unable to over deliver that THB. So if you're seeing this massive rise in THB during exercise, most likely you're going to be pointing towards a respiratory limited athlete. But the cardiac limitation still plays into it.
Right. It's on the supply side, not on the utilization side, and supply
Correct.
is both respiratory and cardiovascular. To that point, and I don't want to speak in his place, but that was part of the exchange that we had with Andre on that same graph that I sent you. And what he was pointing out is that from his perspective, interpreting that rising spike in THB during the 1 minute rest times on a 515, for example, as being a result of vasodilation from an accumulation of CO2, for example, or nitric oxide, might not be the best interpretation, due to the fact that the site where the Moxy monitor measures is the capillary beds, and the capillary beds can't vasodilate as such. They're on an on or off mode, right? It's an all or nothing kind of principle. And so what is the goal here is obviously not to put your perspective against Andrew's. Obviously, you guys work together, you're on the same team. But what is your perspective when you hear that, and what would be the rationale behind the answer?
No. So so Andrew has been in the game for a really long time, and his dad Jurg was the guy who's developed this 515
Yeah.
stuff. So it's kind of like in his DNA per se. So I have a tendency to listen to what Andre's saying. He's an extremely smart guy. So I would say, yeah, that's an extremely valid point. The capillaries don't have that smooth muscle, or the smooth muscle within the actual capillary beds themselves. So it's probably a challenge then to measure if there is vasodilation, vasoconstriction going on, because we're not actually measuring the arterioles, which I'm pretty sure, I got to remember back to my cardiophysiology class, that has the smooth muscle in it. But all of those areas are still reacting to what the muscle is putting out.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe it's not adequate just to look at THB when identifying a respiratory limitation, because you would need to identify if the person has, the FEV1 over FEV6, I believe that's one of the measures. If they have limitations in that.
Yeah, or have the VO2 master or a Pinoe on and actually measure what is going on the respiratory side to be able to determine, hey, there's a drop in minute ventilation starting at that intensity, and that's where we need to focus the work.
Or an inability to increase minute ventilation after a certain point as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So yes, I think that it would be a good starting point to be like, oh, this could be a respiratory limitation. Although, as Andrew does point out, you don't have the reaction from the capillaries to those metabolites just because they don't have the smooth muscle to do so. So I would say it's probably a good starting point. And, to amend my response to you on the forum, I would say just that. It's a good starting point. There could be a respiratory limitation, but you need more measurements in order to actually determine if it's respiratory limitation or cardiac limitation. And just from that perspective, like, we're not actually measuring cardiac output ever with the Moxy monitor.
Yeah.
And I don't know of a good device. Like, I've been on a few cardiovascular physiology papers, and I don't know of a good device that actually measures cardiac output well.
That's definitely that's got to be the biggest missing part of this whole equation, right? Because we're able to get all the ventilation data, we can get respiratory frequency, tidal volume, minute ventilation, all the gas exchange information, VO2, VCO2, the way those interact during an effort. We can get SMO2 at the muscle site, we can get THB trend, we can get heart rate frequency, or heart rate, sorry. But we can't get how much blood is coming out of the heart from a volume standpoint. That's got to be the biggest missing link in this whole. I guess the assessment would be almost, the loop would be complete if we had that value, if we could measure that accurately. Would you agree to that?
Yeah. I think I don't know of a good way of us actually measuring cardiac output other than I think with like cardiac patients, what you can do is you can do a radioactive dye within the blood, and then you can do an MRI on somebody's heart while they exercise and stuff. Obviously that's not going to ever happen with like an athletic population, as cool as that would be. That would probably be the gold standard in seeing heart perfusion and then potentially measuring flow. But another thing that could potentially be of use is, maybe if there's a little bit more sensitive devices for measuring like mean arterial pressure or other things like that, because all of those are tied in. And, then from, if you know two variables, you can figure out the third variable in equation, right? Yeah. So maybe through that, we'll be able to figure out cardiac output. But yeah, as of right now, like you were saying, I think that's what we're missing majorly. And doesn't look like that's going to be solved like really anytime soon, unfortunately.
Anytime soon. Yeah, definitely. Philip, I have one last big question for you, and I really appreciate you answering all those little detailed ones. I know they weren't easy, and I definitely didn't want to, put you in a hard place, but again, I appreciate you going there and trying to decipher all these complicated information for us today. So the last one might be, what have you been most surprised of when looking at the physiology of elite endurance athlete? What really like kind of pops out in your mind? What is so different than the average human being in those populations?
Yeah. So there was a really cool paper that Andy Jones just published, and he had a bunch of other authors, but they were talking about, he worked on the Nike Breaking 2 project, and they wanted to see what the differences in elite level physiology was between these 2-hour marathoners, and what it took to actually run a 2-hour marathon. And what impresses me is the fact that these athletes have a high VO2 max. So, like anywhere about like 60 to 70, most likely closer to 70. They have they're extremely efficient in their running. So they're able to maintain, these extremely high paces. And then they are able to maintain somewhere between 80 to 90% of their VO2 max for 2 hours. That's incredible to me. Like, it just absolutely blows my mind. And if you ever watch like people trying to run as fast as Eliud Kipchoge did for the 2-hour marathon on a treadmill, most people can't even do that for like 100 meters. So then what people decide to do is they decide to take like, they're like, oh, if you want to be like a big, bulky, super strong athlete, you need to do sprint repeats and all this sort of stuff. So they show the sprinter and like all the muscles and stuff like that. And then they show, like the sickly looking marathon runner. And what people don't understand is how fast those marathon runners are running for 2 hours is faster than your sprint could ever be. So yeah, so it just always humbles me to know that there are people out there that through their physiology and athletic development and the years and years and years of training that they have done can run a mile, or can run 26.2 miles at a faster pace than I've ever ran 1 mile. Like, it just blows my mind.
Yeah.
And I
have the same feeling when I looked at I was somewhat competitive on the rower for a little while. And I'll get back there. I've got unfinished business with this machine. But when I was looking at my best 2K and then looking at the world record 1 hour row, and the guy's rowing my 2K pace for an hour. And the day that I did this, that my time, I was literally dying on the floor for an hour. I was crumpled into a ball. I tried to sit on a bike, do what all the smart people said, active recovery. I sat on the bike for about 5 minutes and I was like, fuck that shit. I cannot sit on this bike. And I just curled up into a ball. I found a mat and I literally curled into a ball. And whether it was left side, right side, back or front, there was no comfortable position. And there was literally the most painful time of my life. And the guy just pulled out for an hour straight. And I wanted to give up when I saw that.
Yeah, it just always blows my mind. Like, yeah, so for instance, my best 2K time was, so much slower than like even like the best guys on the rower or on the rowing team as well. And I just remember getting done with it, and like the last 3 strokes, I actually could only see like 1 dot on my screen with like and then afterwards I just slumped over and just couldn't move for like 10 or 15 minutes because I was just so spent. And then you have these guys, that are ladies included, who are pulling the same thing as you for an hour, and you just did it for 6+ minutes, and you're dying, and then they're probably going to be fine afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. Talking about elite athletes and on the endurance side, I don't know if that's something you've had time to dig into. So if not, we'll just pass. But something that Evan mentioned was. And I don't even remember the exact term, but mitochondrial uncoupling or decoupling. Does that speak to you in any way? Essentially,
I think
do you have anything?
Go ahead.
Yeah, the big thing was, I believe, was that just because you have the same VO2 max, obviously your efficiency can be different on the technical side of your event, but you can also have different efficiencies on the mitochondrial side. And depending on what background you have in terms of ancestry, whether you're more from the northern hemisphere or I guess closer to the pole or closer to the equator, there are some significant differences, which might explain why you see Nordic folks with very high VO2 maxes, but like ungodly high, like 90 plus. But that might not actually transfer directly to a huge performance because of that mitochondrial situation. Whereas Kenyans that might not have, to just give one example, obviously, but the popular one, that might not have an absolutely high VO2 max, but through their mitochondrial efficiency, I guess, if that's a thing, they're able to get a lot more out of the whatever O2 they're able to take in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting perspective, and I haven't heard or talked about that with really anybody. But what I could imagine is that say for instance, right, you have ancestry from people who have grown up in these higher latitudes where it's cold all the time, right? So what your mitochondria do, aside from ATP resynthesis, so keeping your energy stores adequate, is they can actually produce a lot of heat. So during high intensity exercise, mitochondria actually get up to about 50 degrees centigrade, which is incredibly hot. Like, yeah, incredibly hot. So so maybe from that perspective, a lot of these Nordic skiers who have 90% VO2 maxes of 90, which is incredible. Maybe they are losing more of their energy, especially at that high intensity exercise, to heat.
Because they've evolved to produce heat as a way to they've evolved to be mitochondrially inefficient for heating
to
stay
warm. Yeah. I mean, and that's just like, that would just be kind of like a first glance hypothesis. And I do not know very much about that sort of stuff, but it seems in line. And there's people actually, so in the bodybuilding community, there was a drug that got popular for a while. I can't remember what it's called, but it essentially allowed for the uncoupling of mitochondria. So you could your body heat would just go through the roof, and then you would essentially just be using your fat stores because that's your mitochondria use a lot of fat for the substrate. So if you uncouple the ability of like the mitochondrial complexes to synthesize ATP, then you can just pump through that fat. And fortunately it got banned, but unfortunately a lot of people abused this, and then they died of heat stroke because because they were like taking too much of it, and then their mitochondria were going so crazy and operating so hot that they actually like would denature proteins within their muscles and their cells and stuff, and they would die.
That's crazy.
So kids I can definitely
kids don't do drugs. That's the
exactly.
The little disclaimer for everybody listening.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
From the conversation with Evan, I do think that heat was a part of that equation on the decoupling side. So I think it does tie into what you're talking about and makes more sense now for sure.
Yeah. And it would be interesting to see if, because I know that there's a higher level of decoupling in brown adipose tissue versus white adipose tissue. I just don't know what the extent of that would be in, say, skeletal muscle. But I do know that there is some level of inefficiencies, within the mitochondrial respiratory chain that could then be leading to overloads in heat. And it would be really interesting to actually get to see what the differences are in so what we would call that in mitochondrial respiration would be electron transport capacity. So the amount of oxygen that your body can use by just transporting electrons through your mitochondrial respiratory chain versus coupled respiration, which means that those electrons that are moving are actually being used to synthesize ATP.
Mm.
And what we can do in our experiments is we can enforce an uncoupling and then see how much capacity we have to continue to push electrons through the electron transport system without ATP as well.
Yeah. Interesting.
So yeah, so look for like part 2F on my dissertation to be something along those lines.
That's awesome. Philip, again, I really, really appreciate your time, and I appreciate you trying to answer all those really hard questions that I brought up. To finish on maybe an easier, lighter note, what do you look forward to seeing from the Moxy and the NIRS community in the coming months and years?
Yeah. Well, I am extremely encouraged by these sort of conversations, because I think that, you know, when people live in kind of this world of sounding board and confirmation bias, then we never grow and get better. So I want to kind of throw it out there to everybody that through the development of these technologies and methodologies and having, you know, great people on the front lines like yourself, I am always kind of changing the way I think about Moxy and the interpretation of it based on new information that's introduced to me. So I'm hoping that through the community of people using Moxy more, we can continue to have and build upon this research and understand the physiology underlying performance and in sport and all of that. And then also I'm really excited for the Moxy portal, actually, because I've been waiting for, you know, something to just give me like auto regulation workouts and other things along those lines, which is really going to help simplify the process and the interpretation of NIRS variables themselves, and hopefully open it up to a larger range of people. As opposed to just the people who are kind of been the early adopters as of late, you know, like the really intelligent guys like Aaron Davis and Evan and Andre Feldman and all of those guys who are like on the front lines, really understand physiology and the interpretation and all of that, and just provide really good information for all of us. So I really enjoy being part of this community, and I am excited for kind of the next steps of it. And as always, I mean, Sean, if you ever have any questions or anything like that, anybody who has questions about Moxy can always reach out to me. My email is philip@moxymonitor.com, and that's Philip with one L. Or you can reach out to the free Moxy forum and just post your graphs, post a little bit of context, and we have a ton of people who either answer questions or do our best to answer questions and everything. But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I do appreciate the hard questions, because it helps me think about this sort of stuff. So thank you for that.
No, it was a great pleasure, man, and hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thanks.